recording now. Wonderful. Just a quick housekeeping thing. I won't be putting time stamps in the chat. I think you can all time yourselves. If you need timing, just tell me, and probably one of us would be able to put timestamps in the chat. But I think it's better if we focus on judging. Then, without further ado, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open this debate. Hear, hear.
All right. Actually, I might just sit down. I presume I'm visible and audible. If not, just like scream at me. I would prefer POIs through like, if you could like turn on your video and like wave at me or like scream at me or like something like that, that would be ideal. But if you put it in the chat, like I might see it. I'll probably take one around 5 minutes. Muzi and I are both immigrants in the United States from developing countries where we are hoping to get high-paying jobs in the United States. And thus, we're very proud to stand to defend our existence within the United States in the first place and in other countries where people like us try to integrate too. Two pieces of framing before I get into my arguments. Firstly, I think the interest of highly developed countries is in the kinds of people that live there right now to make sure that they have the prospects for long-term economic growth, to make sure that their economies are robust to the changing demographics of the world and the changing labor markets in the world. And specifically, we think they have an obligation only to the current citizens of people who live there and to the future citizens of these countries, because the state exercises a monopoly of violence over these people and has a massive amount of interest in making sure that they have like has a monopoly of violence, so it gets like a duty of care in reverse and has to fulfill that duty of care on our side of the house. So we think that the only obligations are the future and current citizens of this country. Secondly, what does this look like? I think this looks like the H-1B program in the United States being vastly expanded, things like the employer level sponsorship that occurs in the United States and status quo, or through like the UK system, which is like basically allowing anyone with a top university degree from various countries to be able to access immigration policies within these countries. Why then do we think this is particularly valuable in status quo? The first argument has that just people who are paid highly contribute more to society than people who are paid lowly. I know this sounds like somewhat unwoke, but let me explain to you why this is the case. The first reason is that they build valuable goods and services. I know that they build valuable goods and services because they are paid as if they build valuable goods and services, which the society seems to need. The second thing is that they often tend to be much higher educated, given the fact that often high-paying jobs require education levels require education standards for their kind of jobs, which means that they're likely to have higher educations and higher bases of knowledge which they bring to these countries. But thirdly, I think just note that the jobs that tend to be paid the highest are the jobs that are most in demand. This means that they are the places where the country lacks those particular skills. An example of this looks like the STEM and engineers in the United States, where they are paid highly, not because engineering is like harder or more valuable than other fields, but because the United States specifically lacks engineering degrees and specifically lacks good engineers, which means that you're likely to want more of them and thus you pay them higher, which means that immigrants in our model definitionally fill in the jobs that are most lacking in talent on our side of the house. But fourthly, I think that in the capitalist system, your salary is literally a determinant of how much you contribute to society and how much society thinks you contribute to society. Mitigate preferences of people and ensure that we are getting in the people who are most wanted by the country in the first place. Given that people like the countries have given they have an only principled duty to listen to their citizens, we think we exploit that on our side of the house. We are principally only legitimate in accepting these people in the first place. But why is this good on a pragmatic level? 5 impacts here. Firstly, I think you fix the economy, right? I think a large number of jobs that exist in their side of the world are likely to be outcompeted by cheaper jobs in developing countries. Given that labor prices are much cheaper in these places, they're likely to be able to just be like you'll never have like industries like farming successfully exist in the United States, because these will always be outcompeted by people doing this work for far cheaper because of purchasing power disparities in the developing world, where they're able to pick apples for much cheaper than they are in the United States, which has some level of minimum wage laws, but also just a higher cost of living in the first place. But secondly, they can import the things that they need on our side of the house very easily, because the developing countries tend to have extremely favorable trade deals, which means that they tend to just be able to have extremely good like free trade deals through things like NAFTA and through the control of like global institutions like the IMF, which means that they can import things for very cheap from these countries in the first place, so they don't need to develop these things in-house. But thirdly, you put more money in the financial system, right? I think people who are paid more pay more in taxes. This is good because taxes fund every single thing in the government and helps every single thing in the citizens of these countries. Fourthly, they also send in less remittances and do more investments in the economic system of these countries. Given that they are paid more, that means that other companies have startup capital from you, have more money to like play with and invest in the long-term future and growth within that country. And you get more money in the American stock market or like the Western stock market, which is good for the world in overall. Fourthly, I think automation is a huge problem, right? The jobs that exist on their side of the house, the low-skilled jobs, the low-paid jobs that exist are more likely to be automated away in the future, which means that you're going to have to deal with these people being in your country and being unemployed, which means that they don't contribute anything of society, anything to this society 10 years down the line on their side of the house. But fourthly, I think the people on our side of the house are people who do the automation on our side. Like they automate away the jobs, which means that you rely less on imports in the future. For example, like textile manufacturing can be easily automated within the United States. So you have to stop importing these things from Bangladesh in the future. Fifthly, I think lowly paid labor, often if they lose their jobs, or even if they don't lose their jobs, rely on welfare states, which means that you have to spend more tax money on keeping them in this place in the first place. Fifthly, I think that they lead to massive amounts of job creation, right? I think that they have massive entrepreneurial skills, which means because they've had higher educations in the past and had generally had a higher level of like employability, which means that they have had more employable skills and better ideas than the average person within the countries that they immigrated from, which means that they have better chances of forming entrepreneurial skills. And fifthly, they also have an access to venture capital in a way that people don't on their side of the house because they are able to like network with the rich people. Theo.
The inventor of the fidget spinner is probably a millionaire. What kind of value does he bring to the country?
Like, I have no idea what that POI meant, but I think that the inventor of the fidget spinner had created massive amount, like firstly, he paid massive amounts of taxes to that country, but secondly, he probably created a factory for those things, which created massive amounts of jobs. But thirdly, you can export that fidget spinner, and every time you export goods to other countries, you get massive amounts of tariff rebates, which allow you to import other necessary goods for the country in the first place, such as like food and clothes, which because like, the labor that you provided is more intellectually valuable. So even if you import less of it, you're able to import high. Like even if you export less of it, you're able to import more natural resources in trade, which means that your country's future growth is better. Fifth, I think why is this important, right? We get more immigration over. Second argument is that we just get more immigration overall because we get less racist backlash. Why is this the case? You don't interact with the people who like the most racist people in developing countries don't interact with the people in high-paying jobs the most because they tend to live in very different places. They tend to live in different cities. But secondly, they also just don't take away your jobs, right? A big reason that immigrants are hated in status quo is because they take away the jobs of people within these countries. High-paid jailers don't do that because they fill in niches. Why is this good? Firstly, I think these countries often have massive aging populations because having children is really unpopular and really expensive. This means that you have a new young workforce coming into these places if you get more and more immigration. But secondly, we get less racism within these countries, which is good for the diversity of these countries, which I think is an inherent good, but also means you have a diversity of political and different opinions within these places, which is also good for your bilateral trade agreements and your relations with the world. We're very proud to stand in the opening government.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, hi everyone. Due to circumstances, I find myself in the middle of Delhi, where I'm taking this call from. So hopefully this is not too loud. It was loud on the other side of the road. I hope it's understandable. Yeah, I'm also on data, so yeah, if no one's got their cameras on, that's great. If I cut out, I just let my partner know. I'll take POIs in the chat. All right, just giving you a time to set up and then I'll begin. The problem with the YOLO case is that they just don't engage with the reality of what's actually going on in the real world. There were so many points in which they said stuff which just isn't true, too many to count, but 2 bits of miscellaneous responses I'll start with at the top of my speech. Firstly, is this this line coming out from OO saying that, oh, high-paying jobs are high-paying by virtue of the fact that they are like very heavily in demanded. And so like obviously it just means like these highly paid jobs are the ones that we need people for in order to fix the economy. Like recognize this is like not the full picture, the price of your income is determined by both supply and demand. But we say importantly in the labor market, the way that wages are calculated oftentimes, especially when they're set by employers, is through the amount of value creation that is added, by that worker working in your factory or whatever job they're doing. Oftentimes that's correlated with high levels of education. I'll get to that later, but just because it's high paying doesn't mean that the economy is like there's like a huge lack of those jobs that needs to be filled. Okay, second bit of rebuttal is just like this whole thing about it's going to be bad because like what's going to happen when like these jobs get automated out and then we have a whole bunch of like people stuck in the country. Like recognize the policy, we're probably not going to be like giving away PRs for free. We're probably going to put them on like employment passes, and then I think there's going to be some flexibility around that, but we're definitely not giving away permanent residence as part of our model. Okay, then what 2 points that we're going to bring to you from OO. A lot of this like clashes directly with the material coming from OG. So firstly, I'm going to be talking to you about why we think low-paying, the importance of low-paying jobs and why that's a particular like hole that needs to be filled in highly developed countries, the economies of these nations. And then secondly, I'll be talking to you about the effects of populism and why we think this actually get worse on their side. Okay, then. So let's talk about, I think the nature of the economies of developed countries. And the first observation I want to make here is that I think a lot of the analysis coming out from OG is actually just really, really generic about just like high-paying jobs in general. And and the thing that they're missing is like why that these benefits could only come from immigrants that come into the country with these skills that take up high-paying jobs, because recognize that in a lot of developed nations, in highly developed economies, they also spend, because they're rich and have money, put a lot of investment into human resources. That is, they have the best in education, they've got good university systems, and they're training people with these skills, to be able to fill these roles they talk about. So insofar as OG gives you a material about that's generic to high-paying jobs, we tell you that in our world, we're perfectly fine to fill this with our own citizens that have been trained at the universities that are in our countries, which are already quite good. So I think a lot of the benefit here is just really, really not mutually exclusive. Okay, but then I think the second bit of context I want to bring up here is just that oftentimes in these countries, recognize that low-paying jobs are so essential to economy functioning. But then it looks like simple as stuff like cleaners, as janitors, and perhaps as maids, but also just dock workers and fruit pickers, which are essential to a nation's economy. Contrary to what they say, US actually does a lot of farming. But the point is, these jobs still need to be filled, and recognize that for multiplicity of reasons, there are certain shortages of these jobs. Why is this the case? So I think firstly, for one, is just an aging population. So there are just less young, able-bodied people who are able to take up these jobs. But secondly, I would note that the culture often in these highly developed countries is that going into a menial job is something that's looked down upon, and not many people want to do it. This is why the UK is heavily reliant on Polish workers coming in to be fruit pickers. This is the reason that New Zealand relies on a lot of labor coming in from the Pacific Islands to do this. So these are important to filling these jobs which are citizens otherwise would not be opting in to do. This means, because of the difference in terms of the strength of the currency, it's a much more attractive deal for low-paying workers from abroad to come to your country to do this. And you're probably able to pay them a lower wage than you otherwise for a native local to entice them to work at these things. What this all means then is that we're the side of the house that actually solves a shortage in the labor in the economy, and we're the one that delivers better economic outcomes because we actually fill the roles of these jobs which people aren't paying, but also the sort of shortages they're talking about, we're just happy to fill these with the plenty of fresh grads that we get out of our good universities. Okay, I'll take a POI from Theo. Go.
The issue is that in systems that are highly paid projection immigration systems, is that when you need a lot of cherry pickers or things that you're talking about, you have quotas. The motion is favoring, not exclusively highly paid. A lot of your cases uncomparative.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I think that just means we bring in more of these workers, and you're you just get more economic activity. We think that's a good thing. I don't see the point of your POI. Okay, let's talk about my second point, which is about populism and why we think this is gonna get worse. So I think the first thing to recognize is that for a lot of the reasons I gave you earlier, there probably aren't that many people who are, I guess, within the socioeconomic sort of part section in order to like build these jobs that are probably going to be taken by these like low-paying job immigrants. What this means is like the relative lack of jobs is probably less. So there's probably less populist backlash, but also just more importantly recognize that like rich people being denied a promotion or being denied a job are probably going to be pissed, but they also probably have more resources at their disposal, more free time, etc., to be able to like push back against the state and complain about that. So it should get like, we think you get like far worse populism under OG. Now we think this is really pernicious because like I think what this leads to is a turning inwards of the country, which I think is like really terrible for highly developed nations. And this is because of the reason that oftentimes these countries' economies are based on like high value added manufacturing or services. And importantly, these things need to be exported out to external markets because your own internal market that you can sell these services and goods to is only so big. You need to export that. And at the point in time where like populist leaders get into power because the elites are complaining that like, oh, people are taking our jobs, that's the point in which like you turn inwards, you put up protectionist policies, and you decrease international trade, and you actually make the economy way worse. You make the economy way worse under their side of the house. Okay. Oh, and I think and last like. Another point here about the economy, like miscellaneous point about the economy, is just that like we reduce the amount of remittances that go overseas, so we just had more money circulating in our own at the point in time where most of the jobs that are coming in are low-paying jobs, so therefore the amount that goes out of the economy is less. We have more money circulating in our economy, which is good. Okay, because we're better. So okay, for all those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
3, 2, 1. The first question I want to answer is why it's unlikely that you have a shortage of less productive labor while you have a shortage of highly paid labor. Firstly, we just don't think that in the vast majority of instances, low-paid jobs are undersupplied. The reason for this is a fewfold. 1, we just think that in most instances, obviously, these jobs can take literally anyone. That means factually, you often require a lot of skills in order to work within these kinds of jobs, and therefore it's very unclear why you cannot have a number of people who often get hired within these places. Secondly, we would say they often need significant numbers of individuals these kinds of gaps. That's to say that if they want to fill in all of your farming through these kinds of things, you often require significantly more individuals. Note that this means that the second argument that Rohan made is triggered, and therefore we lead to significantly more racist backlash. The third thing to say is that in most instances, obviously, these jobs are not as required. The reason for this is simple. You've automated the vast majority of these away, and in many cases, you already have robots that are engaging in fruit picking. The entirety of your farmland is based on running singular tractors, and so it's quite unclear why you have significant numbers of these individuals being required within the first place. Fourthly, though, conceding into the absolute best case where you have some numbers of these individuals required, the problem is they don't actually tell you why it's very likely that these individuals are good for the economy. 2 reasons why they're not. Firstly, we would just say that they often rely on things like welfare, which means that if you get paid a very small sum, even if they add some value to the economy, this is often less than the value that they take away, i.e. in the form of and other kinds of things. Secondly, though, we would just note that in the vast majority of cases, you require subsidization and other types of things, which means it's very unclear why you're actually making a good benefit within their world, especially at the point where you need these people to be paid through governmental money in order to access cheaper labor on their side of the house. Lastly, I would just posit that this low-paid labor thing is just actually false. In the vast majority of instances, the amount of low-paid labor required is quite small, and it's only needed in relatively niche industries versus the comparative of the rest of the economy. Second thing, then, why is it actually that we have a significant shortage of high-paid labor? I want to be really responsive here, right? Because they claim that it's likely that high-paying jobs are those where you already have a lot of educated individuals. Firstly, we would just say that it's really difficult to opt into education. Often it takes like 18 years of like just going through high school, then another 4 or 5 years of going to university and a full degree, which means it often takes a lot of time in order to access this kind of education. Secondly, with many people just want to opt to other types of programs. Note that at the point where you've been brought up in a developed nation, it seems very unclear to me why you want to opt into like really high-paying job, because you know you have a baseline standard of living where you will necessarily be paid off by things like fair. So the incentive to want to opt into really high-paying jobs is significantly reduced. Thirdly, we would just posit that in the vast majority of instances, even when there is an incentive to opt into them. There is a limited number of spots in universities and other places. That means that the number of graduates that you can produce per job are often quite limited, and therefore it's unclear to me why you ask this. Fourthly, though, even if you have a number of immigrants, often this is mismatched with the supply. So for instance, places like Taiwan and others often require particular semiconductor individuals. The problem is that the vast majority of engineering graduates don't engage in semiconductor industries, and therefore you require an imposition of labor to deal with particular niches within the market, which likely means and are likely the individuals that you opt in. The result of this is that it's quite obvious that there is a significant gap within highly paid labor, especially when it's very, very time consuming to train these individuals, and it often takes extended periods to actually engage with them on the comparative. That means that it's quite unlikely that you have the kinds of individuals that you wanted to talk about. Secondly, though, I would just posit that economies are moving towards service sector development, right? This is just a broad trend that has been seen in the vast majority of cases, where even places like Germany, that used to be manufacturing hubs, have largely automated these types of jobs. That means that in many instances, even in their absolute best case, the problem is that 5 to 10 years down the line, in most instances, it's just unclear where you're actually going to be able to have these individuals. The response we get from opening opposition is, but guys, you can kick these individuals back to your own country. I think, firstly, this is quite difficult, especially at the point where your economies become reliant on them. But secondly, I would just posit that in many instances, this is just an inefficient way of engaging in these kinds of projects. That is to say that once automation happens, you limit that flow because necessarily these immigrants probably protest about it. It means that you limit the flow and transition to a much larger extent, and therefore you don't access the impacts that opening opposition wanted to talk about. I want to now weigh our case over this before I engage with the second part on racist backlash. Closing opposition before that.
So what is did in Bulgaria when they had an eternal hole of like highly educated, high-paid people was they did things like pay subsidies for people to go to university to study this sort of thing or create internal solutions. Why do you need to bring in the migrants to fix your shit?
The problem is there is a limited number of spots within your own individual universities. Secondly, it is just fundamentally true that you have very small number of individuals who can opt into these types of places. Thirdly, you already provide them a basic degree of welfare. The problem is that you often don't opt into these kinds of projects at the point where it's very difficult to get this type of an education. The comparative is that developing nations uniquely require this at the point where, like, necessarily their narrative is you get to the United States, you're going to have a good job. Secondly, then, why is the backlash on their side of the house significantly worse? I would posit two things here. Firstly, it is just fundamentally true when you bring in significantly more unpaid labor or lower quality labor, the stereotypes that are about them are perpetuated significantly more. That means that the comparative in opposition is significantly worse, i.e., it's likely the case that it generates much more racist backlash. Their analysis is, but guys, rich people backlash a lot. I would posit three responses here. Firstly, rich people are relatively liberal, which means it's very unclear to me why they backlash, especially at the point where social contact and other things means that they often engage significantly more in comparative. Secondly, we would just say that lower economic statuses mean that you often have other incentives to be racist. The fact that you know this person can't sue you in court, the fact that you often disrespect this person, the fact that you don't see them as particularly valuable to society, or often reasons why you don't engage with them to the same extent. That means the amount of racist backlash that you engender is often significantly higher, and therefore you worsen overall policies and worsen populism on their side of the house. The second thing to note under this is that this obviously means that bilateral relations between countries often worsen, and therefore you create much worse outcomes. Lastly, then, weighing against opening opposition. Firstly, we think you're likely to get significantly more immigration within our world. The reason for this is simple. When you have positive stereotypes about individuals, you likely allow more individuals in on our side of the house, and this is particularly good at the point where you have more individuals being able to opt in. Note this expands the whole pool, and therefore we likely solve for opening opposition at the same time as the point where we solve for our harms, because you likely get more individuals overall at the point where these positive stereotypes exist to a much larger extent. Secondly, this creates a lot of value for our economy. I think the important thing is that you often have imported cheap house goods that are created, and therefore you create significant value within the economy. That means you have more money floating in the economy, but it also means that when I'm a doctor, I haven't spent in the local area, I've created a significantly larger money multiplier effect. Note what this means. On their side of the house, most money goes to remittances, versus on our side, it is spent on goods. Importantly, this means you can often import everything else that opening opposition wanted to talk about from your low-paid labor. So you can get your fruit from abroad, but you definitely cannot get your semiconductors from abroad, which is significantly more important to your economic development. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude top half. Here.
Hello, everyone. Could I please check if I can be heard?
You just disconnected there.
Oh no. Is everything okay? Can I be heard?
Now it works, yes.
All right, excellent. I'll start my speech very soon. Please ask me points of information in the chat. I'll open it and I'll take one later in the speech. I think it's very telling that the only example OG can give is America. To a certain extent, their case might work there, but our case works in the vast majority of the highly developed world. This looks like places like Britain, which is importing the vast majority of its dock workers. This looks like places like Poland, New Zealand, and Singapore, Qatar, where immigration policies generally favor those who are poorer because they recognize that they need the vast majority of their own society is aging, and they desperately need like the individuals to take over the low-paying jobs, which are the ones that are actually in shortages, rather than the high-paying ones, which their own people are actually fighting to get. But I mean, even among themselves, right? That's why, for example, so many of these countries actually deal with the idea that even with a university degree, you're not guaranteed a job because you're fighting not only your own people, but in their work, immigrants as well. My case, my speech will essentially prove 4 things. The first is that whether or not states need low-paying workers. The opening government gives us a couple of reasons why they don't. The first is that things are imported, so manufacturing is exported elsewhere. Notice that number one, this isn't true in every single state, but even in instances where it is, let's say you let's say you export all your manufacturing sectors. That's only production. You still need low-paying workers for construction because a lot of countries like Singapore constantly have to build upwards because they have shrinking, they have like higher concentrations of people in cities, thus necessitating more infrastructure projects, as well as, for example, dock workers and individuals who need to move things around to be able to import things in the first place, right? These are not low-paying jobs, but rather, these are not high-paying jobs, rather jobs which are paid quite lowly. Therefore, even in instances where like stuff is imported, you still need low-paying workers to get all of these individuals there as well. The second thing they say is that things are automated, that presumably these low-paying jobs are going to be automated away anyway. I have a couple of responses to this. The first one being, if that is the case, then why do you want your own people taking these jobs, right? Like, if it is the case that your jobs are going to be automated, wouldn't it be then that voters who would vote against automation, who would have massive backlash against this, as well as like let's be left on the streets because they didn't get like they lost their jobs because of this and all of that? Wouldn't this necessarily be a worse thing for your people as compared to if migrants were the ones taking automated jobs, and then the moment that their jobs get automated, we cancel their work pass and they go home, right? I know it sounds cruel, but this is effectively an active debate on behalf of highly developed countries, right? But I've got a couple more responses to automation as well. I also just engage on the idea that it is necessarily the case that things are being automated now. Like, in theory, like 10 years down the line, you might get more things automated. But right now, dock workers and construction workers are still desperately needed to have infrastructure projects go on right now, lest your people be left on the streets because they're not able to build upwards, because that's what the housing market demands in highly developed countries, right? We will then contest that even if it is true like far later, it's just untrue that it actually happens. Now we need low-paying workers to ensure our people are off the streets and like we continue to develop our countries now. But the third thing I'd say is that like it's also just it's just untrue that like robots necessarily will take over everything, right? The fact is the flexibility of a construction worker to be able to like do multiple things on the house or just like on a construction site is something that robots necessarily cannot do in the status quo and probably in the foreseeable future as well. As a consequence of this, you just like what's the end point of this analysis and why this is so important? The reason why this analysis and the thing I'm proving is important is because the vast majority of their arguments, including the arguments on populism, flow from the idea that you're actually displacing workers. Insofar as I've already proven to you that there is a high demand for these workers, then you're not really displacing anyone. In fact, notice that they didn't engage with Ian Chu's material. What did he tell you? He told you that in highly developed countries, the majority of the population is highly educated. This is because of universal education programs like those provided by the EU, like those provided by Singapore, like those provided by New Zealand and Australia. This means, for example, that yes, you do have people who spend 18 years in high school and university. Like that's the norm in highly developed countries. It's just untrue that people want to rely on welfare. I think that's a bit of a ludicrous piece of framing coming from like the DPM speech. It's just untrue. The vast majority of people are highly educated and are aging as well. It is like that's why we need younger people to be able to take on these manual work so that we actually get to continue importing things rather than having shortages as a result. The second question in this speech is, does this economically benefit countries? Like we argued a couple of things. Number one, that generally speaking, get like the ability, like on our side of the house, yes, even if it is true that we have a need for highly educated individuals to take over certain semiconductor jobs. We see no reason why we cannot just educate our own people and do all of these things. In fact, we are already doing it, right? That's why so many highly educated individuals in America are working at Starbucks for some reason, right? That's because of the highly competitive job market in highly educated sectors. The structural reasoning behind this is that the standard of living in highly educated countries is so high that so many people get these degrees, but there's no necessary link between the number of spots in a degree and the number of spots in the job market. Thus, they create to oversaturated market actually are on the top and in highly educated fields. But the second structural reason why it benefits like developed countries to do this is because of the amount of remittances. OG says, when you have a rich migrant, you will spend more here. To a certain extent, that's true. They will buy some things for themselves and some comfort items for themselves. But for the most part, they also have people at home that they care for. Parents probably funded their university that they want to give back to, right? Siblings who might want to have help to get tier 2, and you might want to fund your siblings' university. Heck, you might even have someone romantically attached to you at home and just here to be able to work and get money and go back to them. Or you might even want to retire back home because you're not so comfortable with the foreign language and foreign people that you have here. All of this means that likely that money will go out of your country if it's highly paid. In our world, yes, money goes out of your country, but it's much less because you're paying them less as well. I'll take that PY from CG.
I want to be absolutely clear. You love to talk about the UK. You deal with high demand shortages, having a big quota, to even if it's points based, for cherry pickers if they need cherry pickers. Your case is really uncomparative.
I mean, that's an example of our case, right? Like you have quotas for individuals that you need, as well as outside the UK as well. Like the vast majority of the demand that comes from low-paying industries as well. Like the UK is an example where people are upset because they're taking their highly paid jobs as well. The third idea is on racism and racist backlash in general. The opening government says rich people are liberal and therefore they will not get upset when people take their jobs. I mean, I'm a liberal person, right? But if someone took my job, I'd be pretty pissed. Like, if I could not get an income for myself and I had to keep living in my parents' basement, I think I'm a loser even though I have a degree. I probably would get upset regardless of my political affiliations, right? I think that most people respond very strongly to economic shocks as well. But then but notice that this is contingent on, right? But notice that the inherent analysis is contingent on poor individuals being the ones who are displaced necessarily. I fundamentally disagree with this, right? As long as I've proven to you that the individuals who are displaced are oftentimes those who are rich, that's when the backlash necessarily comes from. But notice Ian also gave you material that was not responded to, right? But how rich people are oftentimes the ones who are more able to lobby governments because they are more likely to show up to vote. They can lobby and pay money to politicians and donate into political campaigns and all that. All of this means that their side of the house is the ones with more racism, more backlash, etc. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And I'd like to call upon the member of government to open closing house. Okay.
Okay, I prefer audible POIs, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG is going to explain to you why specifically highly skilled, highly paid immigrants that developed countries need in order to have specialization of their economies, why that specialization is so important and why they rely on those immigrants for it. Then later I'll talk more about the trade-off of levels of immigration. Okay, straight on to specialization of economies. So first, a characterization explicitly of who most of these people are. But this is who is projected to earn money. Most immigrants going to wealthy countries are not already that wealthy because they're coming from poorer countries with less advantages, right? And usually these are people like students from semi-developed countries, right? From China or somewhere like that going to the US, for example, because those are the people who are likely to earn well, but usually in the long term. They come for a couple of reasons, right? First, there's just a really high demand. Places like the US, like the UK, have really powerful, well-funded, really high reputation, legacy, higher education institutions, which have all the links to powerful industries in these countries that these people want to go to. So there's a strong demand. And there's those links and these reasons why this happens. Like poorer countries want to develop their own higher education, so they tend to build relationships with academia in the developed world, right? So they can have things like exchange programs or have funding from Harvard for a lab in their own place. So that means that there tends to be a really strong relationship. And wealthy countries really want to take these people because they're very useful for their economy, right? Why do you need these people specifically? This is a challenge from LO that you don't get from opening government. A few things. Firstly, funding. When you have a lot of students coming from internationally, you can charge them rip-off fees, and you make loads of money for your highly paid institutions. This is important because when you have specialized industries, these things require a lot of research and funding. And so when academic institutions get that, you end up with better industries. You also just end up with better experiences, even for local domestic students, right? So if you say, well, there's skill in the country, well, that's better captured at the point where you have the money in order to spend on students because you have this funding, either from the students themselves, or also, as I said, often countries themselves want to subsidize their own people going to another nation because, again, you're building up higher education in your country, or you want remittances, things like that, right? Why is this really important? Further reasons. Okay, often unique skills. So people coming from certain countries will have certain things in their education system prioritized that aren't necessarily prioritized in a wealthy world. So you get particular advantages. Secondly, scale. You just need a lot of people if you're going to have a really strong specialized industry like the tech sector in America. It needs a lot of workers. But most importantly, something completely missed by opening is comparative advantage. i.e., to have a really successful specialized industry in your country that makes a shit ton of money, it must be the best in the sector, right? You don't just want to have a tech industry in America. You want to have the best one. And what does that mean? Economics here. Not just that you're good, but that the other people are worse. And this is why immigration is really important. You really want to capture the immigrants from China. This is why the US is currently doing a massive drive to do this at the moment. Not just because you want them for your economy, but because you don't want them in the other economy. You don't want your competitor state to have an industry that is able to develop in order to outcompete you, to be the person who gets the investment, who gets that. Because when you're the most profitable specialized industry, like in the US, that means you get not only just the most profitable products, because they're probably the best, but also you get long-term things like your industry is attractive to people to invest in. There's high confidence in that industry, right? And therefore you get speculative and wealthy investors putting lots of money in. But also you have a cyclical effect of as attracting talent, not just from students, but also just from workers. You get the best people in the world excited to go to the Silicon Valley and equivalent kinds of areas, right? When you have a density of people, therefore you also have a spiraling effect of skill working in collaboration with each other. So these industries tend to be really effective at the point where they are competitive against other nations. Why is there a tipping point for specialization in highly developed countries at the moment, right? Note two things. These states usually have the upper hand currently, but they are also, secondly, in the process of losing it, right? The reason, as I said, the US is afraid of China is because they currently have the big tech sector, but these nations that are starting to become more developed over time are investing in their own, right? So this is the crucial point at which, by investing in lots and lots of people who are skilled, highly skilled workers who can go into a specialized industry, you ensure that you remain the top dog, you remain the massive, powerful economy in the long term. This is really important in terms of the fact that there's a long-term economic impact, because I think two things. Firstly, OG said they were going to talk about the long term, but really it's very speculative in terms of things like automation and stuff like that. I'm giving you specific structural reasons why you're likely to get a long-term benefit. But on OO, I think even if we buy all the stuff that OO says about you having fruit picking that's harmed, I think these are short-term damages, right? You probably are a wealthy economy who can survive shocks in the short term in order to develop in the long term. The US is doing great at the moment, but their main concern is that, again, that they're going to be overtaken by China in 50 years. This is how you prevent that. This is how you make a strong economy in the long term, which benefits more people by scale, right? Secondly, you get benefits of a specialized industry for reasons other than economic, geopolitical and nationalistic reasons, right? If you have a very specialized tech sector, this is really good for a couple of things. Firstly, diplomatic leverage over the fact that, for example, people need semiconductors. You now get to have favorable trade relations. You now get to have better relations with other countries because they want to appease you because they know you could cut these things off. But secondly, nations care about, either because they're genuinely under threat or because of nationalistic support of people in their country, about militaristic and geopolitical things, right? It's usually really important to have a powerful tech sector, for example, in order to have good military equipment, to have the best surveillance, to have the best tanks, to have the best planes, etc., right? All those things are done better when you have a specialized industry. That's another reason why the US, again, really doesn't want China to have super strong technology that they are not behind, because then they lose that militaristic advantage. I'll take the POI from OO.
So none of your extension or case explains why we can't do this by giving money and education to our own people who often need it to survive and advance.
Okay, I do give you many reasons why you can do this. You can educate your local people as well. As I said, it's better at the point where you have more funding and at the point where you have more investment. So if you have a strong industry, you also probably get private subsidy of students in that industry, for example. I think you're just not listening to my speech. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about, I think that I've substantially shown why there's a tipping point about specialization in highly developed countries, why this is their most important concern. And therefore, I think we cleanly beat OG in terms of the specificity, the recognition, and the scale of impact. But let's talk about the trade-off. I think that it's unlikely that you're going to have a significant trade-off of loads of low-skilled immigrants. No, what is the trade-off that causes immigration camps? Immigration is really good for the economy. The thing is popularity, right? Which has been talked about a bit in opening. But popularity is not affected by this. The reason that immigrants tend to be unpopular is because people think the stuff that OG thinks, which is mostly a myth, but they think it, right? That they strain public services, that they compete against the poorest workers, that they're associated with like negative social things like crime, right? Nearly all of the things I just said only apply to poor people. They're worried about those people. They don't think a rich immigrant is going to be using like public services to a great degree, right? Instead, they're seen as the model immigrant, the person who's aspirational, as is accepted as the person who's allowed to go into a wealthy country. On OO, they say things like you're going to have people afraid of rich immigrants taking rich people's jobs. Rich people can just find another job. I don't know why they're so resentful, but they're also a small number of the voters. I think that really so this means that this is not going to substantially affect the number of poor migrants, which is a separate issue. Therefore, you don't have a substantial trade-off in the first place. Gov side is clearly better. Propose.
Thank you much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Every single team's line in this debate is why rich immigrants or high-paid immigrants are good, why low-paid immigrants are good, and all of these sort of particular things. We'll take a bit of a different stance that I'm very surprised nobody has yet taken. It's not that they're good or bad. It's that not taking legally low-paid immigrants is a harmful thing for those countries. Why? Because they will enter illegally anyways, and this is comparatively much worse than if we take them. We'll prove that this harm, and then we'll weigh this harm against any other benefit in this debate. So like we'll prove that the harm of illegal immigration is much worse than the benefit of like educated people coming into your country, all of this sort of thing. Why does illegal immigration happen anyways, uniquely on their side? 3 reasons. Firstly, know that very often these people are forced to illegally immigrate. These sort of poor people who are likely to earn little. The reason is because they have no job within their own country and no capability to survive in this sort of way, right? Meaning they're forced to now exit their country and go search for a different place. They're forced to take the risk and cross the border and all these sort of particular things that they now need to do. Here's a very crucial thing though. The immigrants who are expected to be high paid, students and all of these particular things, will not take this risk because they're likely to be able to find jobs at home in this sort of particular capacity. They're likely to be able to do university at home and all of these sort of things. Even if their job may not be as good, they still will not risk their lives. They will not leave their families, all of these sort of particular things, but poor people will symmetrically of this motion. Secondly, note it's substantially easier to be hired illegally when you're a low paid worker than when you're a high paid worker. Here is the intuition. It's much easier to hire a low-paid laborer illegally than it is to hire an IT guy illegally, because the kind of corporations that are going to hire you if you're a low-paid worker are far more likely to be ones who are willing to risk this sort of thing to hire you illegally, and they're also far more likely to be the ones who don't need to look at your credentials. They just need a body to work in this sort of particular thing. They don't care about you being illegal. Know that comparatively this is not the case, as high-paid immigrants who are going to work as ITs, as dentists and all this sort of thing would probably not be hired, and they know this, and this is why they don't come. But thirdly, I mean, this is just factually true. Come on, it's not just America in this sort of way with Mexico and all this stuff. Like the UK has so many Bulgarians and Romanians and all this sort of people coming in. You have so many illegal immigrants entering and working as laborers. I have buddies who are strawberry pickers in London and whatever the fuck, right? These people still enter because there's still mechanisms for them to enter. Risky mechanisms, sure, but when they have no other choice and they perceive that life will be much better, they do it. What then happens? On their side, poor immigrants enter anyways in this sort of way, right? Or low-paid immigrants. You close the front door and you open the floodgates, and then it's madness panel in this sort of way. On our side, they enter legally in a controlled way in this sort of way. You choose where to send them, where you ensure that they have things like jobs and all of these sort of particular things because they're able to enter legally, and the state can do this rationally in the way they assign them all of these sort of particular things. Why is this much better in this sort of? But firstly, I want to say against any straw man main responses. We're not saying we completely eliminate illegal immigration. We're also not even arguing that the same number of people are going to enter on both sides, maybe slightly more enter on their side, but substantially more now enter legally that would enter illegally. Why is this a very big impact? 4 reasons. Firstly, you can now choose where to send them. So opening opposition are right that there are places in the US that have like gaps in this sort of way, right? Like gaps in the milk industry, in the dairy industry, in the Midwest, or this sort of thing. The issue is when these workers enter illegally, you have no option to send them there, right? They just go to the first place they can find, and this is what they do then. They take jobs that are already occupied in this sort of capacity because they can offer their services for less because they are legal immigrants. On our side, when you control immigration, when legal immigrants enter, you can tell them we will let you enter, but only if you go to this particular place and work this particular job when we have a shortage. So you don't have people like immigrants taking jobs of local people on our side, but you have it notably on their side. This means that people lose their jobs. They aren't able to pay their bills, or this sort of thing, which is a problem that we, to some extent, deal with. Secondly, you cannot ensure that they have the conditions necessary for labor. In the status quo, massively when immigrants enter, they may not always have a job when they come over here. On our side, you can ensure them a job in this sort of way, meaning you can only let them enter if you're going to give them this sort of job and tell them, look, this is where you need to work, or this sort of particular thing, like work visas work in this way, and all of this sort of thing. Why is this very, very bad on their side? Because when they don't have a job, they're forced to turn to things like crime. They're forced to, fuck up the community because they have no other choice except to do crime to survive because they have no ability to find a job. On our side, you can ensure that they find a job, meaning that when they enter legally, this does not happen nearly as much. Thirdly, you have an ability to track on how many people, for example, live in your cities, in your towns, all of these sort of things. Why is this very necessary? Because when you cannot keep track, this is when they overwhelm public institutions. I don't know why CG say this is a myth. This totally happens. When hospitals cannot handle how many people come because you have no reasonable census of the population, you have no idea how many people are there. On our side, when you let them legally, you can know how many are there. You can accommodate things like local hospitals and education. Fourthly, you lose substantially more money because their labor is taxed. They still send remittances, but then the state gets nothing because this money just comes out without tax money ever being put on their labor. When they enter illegally, when they enter legally, this is solved. Opening government.
We think that illegal immigrants are actually not really a bad thing. They don't commit crime because they're afraid of getting deported and fill all the jobs that OO wants you to fill, which means that none of their case works if you are true.
I don't care what you think. I'm sorry, there are logical reasons why it is harmful. They fear being deported, sure, but when you have no other choice and no ability to do labor, then how do you say you have no other choice? And they don't take jobs that are not filled in this sort of way because it's not controlled where they go. And they have the ability to quote unquote steal the jobs. I hate this term, but they have the ability to do this because they're willing to be paid less because they're illegal immigrants. Like, I'm sorry, but this is the world. I get debating is very left-wing, but this is how it works in this sort of way. Why is this much more important than any other benefits provided by any teams of immigration? Firstly, know that there are other solutions for the problems they talk about, both are government problems, like you can fund your own people to be more educated. Closing government say, yeah, but you get more money for university, but sure. But this, and for opening opposition thing about having things like dairy industry and all of this, where you can simply move these to another country and get all of these benefits anyway. There is no other solution to illegal immigration because these people will keep coming unless you accept them legally. But secondly, this affects the most vulnerable people, those who lose their jobs to illegal immigration, those who suffer from crime are the ones who experience the biggest harm. If opening government are right that we truly care about the most vulnerable people, then we affect them and the state has duty to them. Vote us.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the government whip to conclude Gossard. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
POIs in the chat, please, not audibly. And I'll take one from opening opposition. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to talk about the interests of highly developed countries, weigh against opening government, tell you why closing opposition is fourth, and then weigh against opening opposition. So, on the interests of highly developed countries, a couple of things there. Alice has already told you these, but I want to reiterate them. Unlike opening government, who explain they talk about America, but the mechanisms are very developed world focused and why just better value and high demand of these jobs filling is important. I think what Alice told you is something specific. Highly developed countries are facing economic stagnation because they get money all the time. Every year they make a profit, but they can't outcompete other countries around them because they're not specializing enough and following the trend of where the economy is going in terms of tech and stuff like that. That's one thing, specialization, but that's just their interest in general. Second of all, they always trade off poor people because they can always take an economic shock and an economic hit. Therefore, anything in this debate about quantity and then increasing the amount of jobs and doing that is not really relevant. And I'll explain what that's going to happen. Anyway, I want to respond to the OOPOI push first before weighing its opening government, which is that, but you can develop the people in your own country anyway. I would posit that this doesn't happen anyway, and there's no incentive to do this for 3 extra mechanisms. The first mechanism, Alistair already gave you, they charge high international fees. Therefore, universities have an incentive to make sure that most of their, at least a sizable proportion of the university students that are in there are international, because they spend like 50,000 USD more if they're international. Second of all, brand recognition. Going to a university like Harvard compared to a university at your own institution is something that a lot of model minorities care about, and they want the brand of Harvard University on their CV, which means they would go there. Second of all, norms in their own countries. Model minorities, you often are seeing your role models going to these countries anyway, and you want to follow them. Parents give you high aspiration because your parents have faced labor market disadvantage and they want to give the best for you, which means they push you to go abroad, which is why we have lots of ethnic minorities in a lot of American and UK universities. And 3, Harvard University does talent spotting at a university that has bilateral relationships with in other countries and will go and try to advertise. Loads of highly developed countries have massive advertising budgets. That responds to OSPOI. We are not uncomparative, and that is really important. Let's weigh against opening government. What's the problems with opening government? I want to control F your note, check your flow. They don't actually mechanize why you have more value. They don't prove why there's high demand, and they don't prove why these jobs exist. Note the PM flippantly said, oh, highly paid jobs exist because there's high demand. And that's it. There's nothing else in opening government to tell you why. Alistair gives you robust mechanisms as to where industry development comes from things like investors setting up labs and expertise, which leads to things like startups and more Silicon Valley-esque areas, because universities develop relationships bilaterally with other countries, but also the state competition analysis to fight for investors, which is you get a chain effect on these sorts of things to begin with. That's the mechanism for demand. We mechanize all of opening government, which they rely upon. Other responses to opening government. A lot of economies heavily rely on low-paid jobs, right? They don't prove why the better societal contribution comes from highly skilled workers. I would argue they do not prove why highly developed countries have certain characterizations that we provide, which means that they are vulnerable to OO responses about just general value. Also, their automation claims are speculative. They rely upon this to prove why we should have highly developed people. Automation is not very big in the status quo, and they don't even give timescale analysis. The DLO has really good responses to automation, and they're probably falling to this to begin with. So yeah, I think opening government's value comes at the end of the DPM, where the DPM is like, oh, we care about cheap goods. But this is contradictory, because the PM says that highly skilled jobs are more important, and they give no characterization about why highly skilled people are good for cheap goods. We explain why specialization is more important. Therefore, we weigh against opening government in 2 ways. We have better interests on highly developed countries, but also we mechanize value, which breaks the deadlock on top half of which value is more important, because we give crucial characterization in CG about why the quota analysis that I give 2 POIs about washes out the entirety of opening government. Opening government are out of this debate. Why are closing opposition fourth in this debate? A couple of reasons. Illegal migration. I'm going to explain to you why migration, like they explain, affects developed countries. It doesn't impact highly developed countries. The only reason it affects the UK specifically is because they have channel boats and they can reach the UK. A lot of the countries, like other highly specialized areas, do not have the same problem. It tends to be like a very European crisis. A couple of reasons mechanistically, or the structural reasons that Bulgaria loves as to why this is not likely to be the case. 1, capital, financial. You have little money if you're an illegal migrant, because you can't travel large distances from poor countries to high income countries. Social knowledge. You go to where your diasporas are, you have little knowledge about higher developed countries because not a lot of your migrants are there in the first place. Because you prioritize risk averse, you go to other countries, not highly developed countries, even if the number is low. Other responses to closing opposition. The people that Alec talks about at the top of their speech, they will cause police and migrant author problems on either side of the house, so they would do this anyway. They said that they don't stop illegal migration. I'm going to take a higher burden, explain why this is symmetric on both sides of the house, because low-paid economic migrants are different to refugees and asylum seekers. Refugees and asylum seekers will always target HDCs, but they'll never target, but low-paid economic migrants will never target these. They are likely going to be slightly more educated, so these migrants will probably choose countries where jobs are guaranteed and the backlash is low because of their economies are less specialized, which means on weighing, they're going to choose less developed countries, not highly developed countries, who beat closing opposition on certain
point.
On overwhelming, before going on to overwhelming public services, I'll take opening opposition.
So immigration policy is different from accepting people to study at your university. So you can still get a subsidy anyway. And you already said that people want to go to university anyway.
No. Because if you love the UK, let me give you an example. There's a points-based immigration system. You get 10 points extra if you're accepted to Oxford or Cambridge as a student. Just, you just have rules and quotas about how points-based immigration systems work. That's just patently untrue. And you don't give any mechanisms for that, so you shouldn't accept that on a POI panel anyway. Another one, overwhelming public services. I hate when people do this because I actually study this and it is a myth. One, tax base. They have to contribute to the tax base or they get jailed. Secondly, they don't do crime because they're afraid of deportation. Third, they tend to just be healthier migrants in general. Fourth, they cannot access public services because they need to live in a country for several years before they are able to access the welfare state. They have to live in 5 years before they get citizenship. So they can't access the welfare state because they're not a citizen, which means that they also just short term. Should they go back to the country because of circular migration, which means they don't actually overwhelm public services. CIO is fourth. Dealing with opening opposition. I think I've already dealt with them in 2 POIs. We washed them out because of the quota analysis. If you need cherry pickers, if there's shortages or high demand, then you will accept them through quotas, which we can, because it's about the motion is favouring, not exclusively, but also high developed countries will just take the shock anyway. They don't care about low paid workers to begin with. For these reasons, we clean this debate, we're going through fast, and for this reason, I'm so proud to propose on this motion.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to conclude the debate as a whole. Here. Yes, slightly quiet, but yes.
Yes, I will scream, don't worry. The Bulgarian thing. So 3, 2, 1. Just on the top of my head, this is not a motion about refugees and asylum seekers because there are special conditions to them in a moment that there is a war and all of those kinds of things. So the government actually changes their policies about refugees and accepting refugees. So this is not a motion about this. Then the motion would have explicitly said it. But also note that most of those countries, such as America, the immigrants there are not refugees nor asylum seekers. So what are the responses to us? The response to us is that the migrants have limited capital. That's why they don't go to highly developed countries, but go only to developed countries. First, you need to characterize which are the highly developed countries, which are not not highly developed countries. In a moment that you don't do that, I am uncertain of the geography that happens in the world. And I would say that the UK is a pretty highly developed country, thus they will go there by boats. But firstly, know that they don't pay for the transportation. There are recruiters there that actually recruit those people to go to those countries, and they will work for the money that they have spent for this transportation. That is how this works. Those migrants don't have any money to do this transportation in the first place. But secondly, where they go where they code, it doesn't matter if they're close to it, if they have the capital, because there are some kind of recruiters that just go to them and say, hey, we need workers in this specific gap of the economy. We need them in America, for example. They recruit them. They do not pick and choose where they're going. Thirdly, know that the highly developed countries are somewhere that are close to the developed ones, so they can actually go to those places, such as from Mexico to America, from Bulgaria to other developed nations and all of those things. But also, fourthly, know that the immigrants are not only people from very underdeveloped countries, but also people from developed countries that go. For example, in Bulgaria, the situation isn't as bad, but we are actually going to illegally immigrate to France, to say, because the situation there is better and we just want to do so. So for all of those reasons, I think that illegal migrants actually do immigrate to highly developed countries, so we're not out of the debate. The second thing that they say is that they don't do crime because they'll get deported. But no, in a moment that we're explaining to you, maybe they don't have an incentive to do crime. But in a moment that they're forced to do crime because they literally cannot survive, and this this is their only option because they have no job, for example, because like the job is not enough, or because they're literally illegal migrants in this country and the work that they have been hired to do is something illegal, they are forced to do so. But secondly, note that they are actually accessing governmental institutions such as healthcare, which also CG is claiming that they aren't. Firstly, by having fake documents, this is happening all the time, this exists. The people who have recruited all of those illegal migrants are providing to fake documentation because they want to get passed by the law. But also note, if they are in such a bad situation that they need to access this hospital or they will die, they will probably go and get deported. They are going to bite the bullet because it's better to get deported than to like die. Other responses to CG and their case, the first thing that they say is you don't want other countries to have those high skilled people, thus you want them within your country. Firstly, not most people are Mark Zuckerberg that you're going to recruit. They're just going to be like people that are working in a hospital or engineers and all of those kinds of things. I am uncertain as to why you want just some kind of basic things such as which is not Mark Zuckerberg within your country, and it's all about other countries to have them. But secondly, note that in the other country, they don't make special innovation. They're not like making some kind of thing that it is endangering you. They're working basic jobs that are necessitated, because in those type of countries, if you're a very good doctor, you'll be just the chief of the hospital, because there is a necessity for very good doctors to be chief of the hospitals. You won't do research and innovation and all of those things. So you actually don't want other people who are very high skilled, because they're actually not threatening you in any kind of way. The second thing that they say is university gets funded more, but know that like immigration is not dependent on your study visa. All of those immigrants come to study to your country with a study visa. This is not a debate about study visas. Like rich immigrants come to study in your country. Anyways, this is like not asymmetrical. On to OG. Why are we then winning OG? Why are the harms of illegal immigration bigger than the benefits of high skilled workers? I think firstly, just weighing the harms of illegal immigration harm the poor population of the developed countries, while the benefits of economic growth mostly are in favor of the rich. Why is this the case? I think the harms of the poor, because firstly, they take their jobs away. In a moment that they are legal immigrants, the government appoints them to places where they don't take jobs of poor people. But in a moment that they're illegal, they actually go and take the jobs of people that are working there. But secondly, note that crimes disproportionately affects poor individuals, because the neighborhood that it is happening in is probably ones of poor individuals, but also like the stores that are going to get burned out and like break into our stores of people that are poor. And I think that harms them way more. But why does the economic growth only benefit the rich? I think firstly, economic growth is speculative in the short term, and it probably affects the poor only in the long term. But in the short term, knows that it just makes more money for the rich people. They never prove as to why in the long term this will lead to any kind of benefits for the poor. But secondly, know that innovation or tech or all of these kinds of things are inaccessible to the poor and only benefit the rich. And this is why on the basis of vulnerability, you should prioritize our case, because we are prioritizing the most vulnerable people and they're not getting harmed, while on the other side of the house, they're only benefiting the rich. Second weighing, certainty of impact. Know that on our side of the house, we are certain about that we are going to overcrowd hospitals, but on their side of the house, the benefit and the extent of economic growth is ambiguous. Because firstly, know that why we are certain of overcrowding and all of those things. Before I continue, yes, opening, fast.
We told you that you can import any of the cheap goods that you want to create in-house due to favorable trade deals, providing high-value services like banking.
Okay. I am going to now explain it to you. Like importing all of those things and automation is actually way more expensive than importing legal migrants within your country, because not like automation and importing things within your country, you have to pay like for the long term. If it's importing, you have to pay for the fuel, for the gas, for all of those kinds of things. If it's automation, you have to give a very big sum up front to buy the machinery and all of those things. But not on our side of the house, immigrants can negotiate their salary. Their alternative is far worse, so you pay them very less money, and they have no protection from the state, so you can pay them a lot less. This necessarily means that it is more like expensive for countries to import than for them to have illegal migrants. Then continuing with the weighing that I am giving to you as to why it is like more certain, our impact is more certain than theirs. Not that overcrowding of hospital is certain, because one, there will always be those people who would enter the country because they necessitate to enter your country. This necessarily means that they don't care if it's legal or illegal. They're always going to come, and in the moment that they're coming illegally, they're coming in a very dangerous instances. They're passing the border and they're probably getting hurt and injured, or where they on the boats and all of those things. Know know that this necessitates for them to go to hospitals, but economic growth is uncertain because it's unpredictable what the demand is and what factors are going to come, such as crisis. Please vote for us.
Thank you very much for this fine speech and for what was a wonderful and lovely debate. We'll go into deliberation, and yeah, thanks everyone, and good luck for the further outruns.
Thank you, everyone. All the best.